Thanks everyone for joining us today to talk a little bit about what you can learn from your donors. Our session is called Listening to Your Donors, What Donors Can Teach You About Your Community Foundation. I'm Kevin Bolduc. I'm the Vice President of Assessment Tools at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And I'm joined on this panel with some colleagues I'll introduce in a second. But before I get into the introductions, I just wanted to spend a second on the agenda of what we'll try to accomplish today, which will involve, as I mentioned a second ago, some interaction from all of you. So what we're going to try to focus on for the next hour and a half or so is talking about the ways in which donors, your donors, can provide some really valuable insight on the work that you're doing as a community foundation, the work that you're doing with them, the work that you're doing in the community, the work that you're doing in your discretionary grant making, all of the above. So we're going to start with a bit of background about one tool that CEP has been using to help foundations, community foundations, get feedback from donors. And then I'm going to ask you to think about your experience working with your donors. And then we're going to hear from three really savvy individual users of donor insights and how they have really benefited from and changed the way that they're working in some cases based on the feedback that they heard from donors when they reached out in a third-party way to get some feedback on the work that they were doing. So who are these folks? Today, I'm joined by Amy, the Vice President of Giving Strategies from the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, Terence from the Napa Valley Community Foundation, and Sarah from Community Foundations of Texas. And these three folks are up here because all of them have participated in getting some level of donor feedback over the last year and a half or so, but they are also up here because they represented a range of community foundations. You can see the differences in the sizes of their community foundations, the geographic focuses of their community foundations. They have different compositions of funds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how it plays into work with donors in a little bit. But I'm really delighted to have them with us today because they have the stories to tell you about what they've learned from their donors. So, and a special thanks to Terence, who actually suggested this session and got it going at this conference. So, thank you. All right, so who am I? The Center for Effective Philanthropy is a nonprofit organization. For those of you who don't know us, we're located in Boston. We have an office out here in San Francisco as well, and our mission is to help funders define, assess, and improve their overall performance. And we do that by helping folks get comparative data that places your work into some sort of context about the other actors in your space and other community foundations or other foundations that might be working on the same issues or in the same geographies that you are as an organization. So we have three ways at CEP of accomplishing this mission, and one is we provide assessment tools to individual foundations that help them understand their own particular performance in the light of feedback we hear from constituents of other foundations. And the donor perception report, from which we'll be drawing some information today, is one of those tools. I think all of you saw in your bags at the conference a little brown and orange handout about this particular tool. But the point today is not really to talk about that tool as much as it is to talk about the kinds of things that we can learn from donors. And that brings me to the second piece of CEP's work, which is really our research agenda. And we'll get to that in a second. We really hope that as more community foundations use this tool to get feedback from donors, what we're doing is building a comparative data set across foundations about how donors perceive their work with different community foundations, how they're engaged and how they're influenced by all of you, which will fuel our ability to do research on the different kinds of motivations and profiles of donors that work with community foundations across the country. So a little bit of background on how we got here. About 8 years ago, when CEP was founded, we started getting feedback from grantees of foundations, community foundations, private foundations, and the like. And one of the things that became very clear very quickly was that grantees were unlikely to give feedback, honest feedback, to foundations directly to their face. It feels really good to get money from a foundation, and so finding a way to break down that barrier so that we can increase the honesty of feedback was a really important goal of CEP early on. And so what we did was create a way to get comparative feedback so that we could place individual foundations' grantee perceptions in the context of similar perceptions from other foundations. And as we worked with community foundations on those grantee surveys, what we heard again and again was, why aren't you doing this for donors? We do donor surveys, but they're often done in isolation, and we don't know exactly how our donors' perceptions and engagement and experiences compare to those of other community foundations. And we held off for a while. We said, no, this isn't the right place for us to start. You guys are getting donor feedback already. You're not getting so much grantee feedback. But we kept hearing that message again and again over the past years. And so it took us a while, but we did think it could be useful to get this kind of feedback from donors and help you all access a different kind of feedback from your donors. So we started out about a year and a half ago with a question of whether this kind of feedback would be useful in a comparative context, which is the kind of work that CEP does. So what you see on the screen in front of you right now is actually one of the questions from the donor survey that these three panelists have used, and a couple other dozen foundations, community foundations, have used over the last year and a half. And this question in particular, we ask donors how well they think that you, as a community foundation, understand their personal charitable goals, what they're trying to accomplish in their giving. And we held our breath to see if donors' perceptions actually differed across foundations, because we weren't sure that they would. So you can see here the green line is the average result for this one community foundation. This is one of the 24 foundations in our data set. And overall, without comparative data, that looks pretty positive. On a 1 to 7 scale, they're just about a 5 in terms of how well they think the community foundation in question understands their goals and strategy. But then when you start to put comparative context in place, the shading is the results of the other community foundations in our data set. Their result starts to look a little bit less good. And we see here, just like with grantees, that there's a positive association with working with a community foundation. You guys all do great work. Donors are proud to be a part of that. And so what we really want to know is, where do you have opportunities, where unique strengths or distinct strengths and unique opportunities to improve your work? So you can see here this community foundation in particular on this measure is rated somewhat below the typical foundation, which is the red line, in terms of how well donors think they understand donors' charitable goals and strategies. So now we knew that perceptions of community foundations differed, and that the profiles and engagement and experience of donors differed across the foundations that we were working with. And to point out that this is not just quantitative information. Donors say different things even when they're using the positive end of a particular scale. So here's the kind of comments that we hear back from donors of all kinds of foundations. On the more positive side, we hear things like, the foundation does an excellent job of helping donors identify their philanthropic goals, plan to achieve them, and then execute that plan. And on the flip side, even though these donors are circling a 4 on a 1 to 7 scale, they're saying things like, when we stated our giving goals and what we were looking for, the foundation didn't understand and didn't seem to try. Now, obviously, this is the kind of thing that really differentiates a successful organization and a less successful organization. And so the comparative data becomes a really important overlay on donors' perceptions, and it becomes a really important piece of the kind of research that we hope to be able to do on donor perceptions across the field of community foundations. So let me take a second and just step back and say, well, what is this donor perception report? Because you're going to hear Amy and Terence and Sarah all talk about it today. So first of all, it's a tool that's based on a comprehensive survey of a community foundation's donors. It's highly customizable to the particular experiences or goals of a particular foundation, of your foundation, but it also asks a standard battery of questions that help us generate this comparative data that adds to the value of donors' feedback for all of you. So the report's based on both this comparative data, on the customized portions of the data, on quantitative and qualitative information, but it also focuses on helping an individual foundation understand differences not only across foundations, but within your foundation, so different tiers or segments of donors that you might be thinking about as part of your work. And it draws increasingly on CEP's experience working with funders like these, as in watching them make changes in their work based on the feedback they're hearing from donors. And their stories, I think, are really compelling ones about how this kind of feedback can really motivate staff internally and create a really positive feedback loop with donors. So as this database broadens, and as I mentioned, we have about 24 community foundations who have participated in this process so far, it really fuels our ability to do research more broadly on motivation of donors and engagement of donors. And that's going to kick off next year when we have just a few more participants. So what's that research going to be on? Well, it's on these kinds of themes, which are the themes that we ask about in a standard way in the donor survey. Donor engagement and preferences for engagement. They're your communications with them and how satisfied they are. What resources do they use from your organization? How valuable do they find them? What are their motivations for giving to you instead of to somebody else? What are their future giving plans? How do they want to involve others in their family? And then obviously these customized topics that are specific to any individual community foundation, to any of you. So this is sort of the direction that we're hoping to go on some of the research. And as we get towards the end of the session today, I would be really glad to hear your ideas about what would be the most valuable pieces of research that we could do as we have this broadening set of donor perspectives of a lot of different types and sizes and kinds of community foundations. All right, so to help you think a little bit about both the research that we might do and then what we're hearing from donors across the field, we thought we'd start with a couple questions for you all to discuss at your table. So let's start with this. One of the questions that we ask in the donor survey itself is to have donors give us one word that they think describes the community foundation that they have a fund with or that they're giving to. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes. I'd love you to talk to the folks around you about what words you think donors would use most frequently to describe community foundations generally and to describe your community foundation. In 3 or 4 minutes, I'll come back and I'll ask you all to shout out, to give me your guesses on what those words are, and then I'll show you across 3,000 donors and a couple dozen community foundations the primary associations that donors have with all of you in the community foundation sphere. So, talk amongst yourselves. All right, I'm glad this is an engaging conversation. I promise you there'll be time for more conversation and some questions in a little bit. But I'm really intrigued to hear what it is that you think your donors across the field of community foundations are saying about their work with community foundations. So thanks for taking a minute to discuss this question of the associations that you think donors have with community foundations. And we'll get a flip chart marker in a second, and we'll take some notes. But there we go. Thank you so much. This is my colleague Joanna Hoffman. So does anybody want to volunteer a word that you talked about that you think is associated with community foundations from either your donors or the field of community foundation donors in general? Community. All right. That's an easy one. Trustworthy. Responsive. Knowledgeable and stewards. Stewardship. Creative. Bank. Oh, vain. Vain, okay. Connector. Resourceful. Expert. Confusing. It's not one of the most frequent words, but I will say it is one of the more frequent negative words used about community foundations. Confusing. Efficient. Engaged. Leader. Okay. That's a lot of words. That's excellent. And that actually, you'll see in a second, that actually does mirror what donors think about community foundations. There isn't a word that comes out that is the primary thing that donors think about when we get to community foundations. But let's take a second and try to rank some of these. We have up on the chart right now community, expert, trustworthy, responsive. I'm going to leave confusing to the side for a second. Stewardship, connector, efficient, resourceful, leader, and engaged. And by show of hands, how many folks think that the most common word used by donors to describe community foundations is community? 0. How about trustworthy? All right, that looks like a good almost a third to a half of the folks in the room. How about responsive? A few, maybe 10%. Stewardship? Couple, maybe 5%. Connector? Even fewer. Resourceful? Even fewer still. Okay, we're getting to the bottom of the list. Leader? All right, that's sizable. Maybe 20% of folks think leader. How about engaged? Engaged, small number. So it looks like trustworthy and leader were the two most frequent guesses about the words that Community Foundation donors use. Well, we have now 2,094 words that donors have supplied. And as I should say, it's 475 unique words across those 2,000 donors. So what are they? Well, here they are. The size of these words are the frequency with which they are used by donors. So the most frequent word is effective. Second most frequent is professional, and the third most frequent is helpful, followed by efficient, responsive, excellent, and there's community down at number 7, caring, convenient, and committed. So those are the words that we hear again and again and again from donors. So this is interesting, because a lot of the words you mentioned are not up on this list. And I think that points out exactly the value of hearing from your donors and what they think about you as a particular organization. Couple thoughts on this, and this to start to think about the kinds of things that we might be able to do with an even broader data set. First of all, somebody mentioned confusing. It was a negative word. Well, it turns out that donors really don't use negative words all that much. There's one on here in the top 50 words that donors used, and it's only partially negative. It's transition. A sense that community foundations, or the community foundations in particular, are in transition. But these wordles, these word clouds, look really different for different funders depending on the particular ways that they're interacting with donors and the particular types of donors who are interacting with them. So I'll show you Terence's word cloud from Napa Valley Community Foundation. I can do this because Terence, and he'll talk about this, made his donor perception report available on his website so that his donors could go and look at what they said about the foundation. His looks like this. It's quite different, actually. Engaged, is the biggest word for the Napa Valley Community Foundation. It's not in the top 50 words for other foundations. So all of a sudden, you see that there's a very different profile, different association with one foundation than there is for foundations overall. So it's this kind of thing that we hope to be able to draw out as we get more foundations into our data set, to be able to say, okay, well, here's what a donor looks like who has this kind of association. Here's a community foundation profile that has this kind of relationships with its donors. We think that'll be really useful in creating a deeper understanding of the community foundation field and a more distinctive articulation of what makes you guys so special.
Kevin, if I may, I think most people were thinking of me when they said slow and quiet, not the foundation.
All right. So I didn't say no one ever used a negative word, but let's go through one more of these little exercises that I hope you all will find interesting. I actually prepared a few more, but I want to get to the stories from these folks. So we'll do one more of these. So one of the questions that we ask on the survey of donors to help understand how they're thinking about the future and not just the present is we ask them what kind of relationship, the ideal relationship they'd like to have with the foundation in the future. And we give them 3 options and then a space to write in some other option if they want. But most people choose one of these 3 options. So I'm going to ask you to think about what proportion of donors you think say that their ideal relationship with a community foundation is as a partner in their giving, or as that they would like some assistance with their giving decisions. They want some information, but they really are going to rely on their own awareness mostly. And what proportion do you think say that they ideally want to be completely self-sufficient and only rely on the community foundation that they're working with to basically manage their funds? And do you think you would be different than the overall profile of donors across community foundations? So question is, what proportion of donors to community foundations do you think would describe their ideal relationship in each of these 3 different ways? So I'll give you, again, about 4 or 5 minutes to talk about this and why, and then I'll come back and I'll show you what the data looks like across the field. All right. So we won't spend quite as much time on this one. Does somebody want to volunteer? What proportion at your table of donors do you think wanted the foundation to be a partner in their giving in an ideal situation? So anyone want to volunteer that number? Range, gut sense? 20%. 40. 20, 40, 15. 10. So the consensus seems to be in sort of the 10 to 20 range with sort of an outlier of around 40. What do you think about the folks who said they wanted to be self-sufficient in their giving? What proportion of those folks do we? So we sound somewhere in this 30 to 45 kind of range for that. Well, you guys are not, I see some folks saying higher. Higher, so maybe 50% in the self-sufficient, still higher. 60% in the self-sufficient range. Here you go. You're absolutely right. Across foundations, across the 24 foundations, 60% of donors said that in the ideal world they wanted to be completely self-sufficient in their giving and use their community foundation mostly to administer their funds. This didn't vary by age, it didn't vary by giving level, it didn't vary by wealth. We don't see a lot of structural characteristics that seem to be driving the ideal relationship. A question? We can, on an individual basis, look at differences in older versus newer relationships. The question was, does this vary by the age of the relationship with the foundation? And I can't answer that from a broad field-wide perspective because we don't have data on that issue from all of the foundations that have participated. But I can say that there have been some instances where we did see this vary by the age of the relationship with the foundation. We've also seen some instances where it varies by the community foundation's own self-defined tiers or segments of donors. So it turns out you guys all have, in some cases, we've seen a pretty good instinct of which of your donors fall into which of these different perspectives. So the question is, how do you change this if you don't want 60% of your donors to think that they want to be self-sufficient and only about 15% think that they want you as a partner for advice? There was one more question, so I'm going to take it and then we'll go to the stories. Yeah, so the question was, does this vary by type of donor? And we do survey donor-advised fund holders as well as scholarship fund holders and other kinds of donors, the discretionary donors to the foundation. Turns out it does not vary. There are almost no differences that we see across our survey between donor-advised fund donors and other donors to a community foundation. There's a slight trend that they rate a little bit lower. They're satisfied a little bit less than other kinds of donors, donor-advised fund holders are, but it really doesn't reach kind of a major finding from our overall data. We'll see as we get more data from more foundations participating. So with that, a little teaser about the way that this data can really inform, I think, the individual foundations who have seen its perspective on how they work with their donors. I'm going to turn it over to Amy Cheney, who will talk a little about her experience at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. The Greater Cincinnati Foundation has conducted donor surveys every few years since the early 1990s. And for a time, we'd been conducting our donor surveys about every 3 years. It got to be 2010, and it had been about 6 years since our last survey, so it was time to do one again. We learned some of the highlights from the results of our donor perception report. We learned that GCF's donors are very satisfied with GCF. They rate GCF just above a 6 on a 7-point scale, so we felt that GCF is giving them what they want. We found that 49% of GCF's donors say that their first source of information about the foundation was a professional advisor. And if you compare that to the average foundation that has used this survey tool, the average foundation's experience, at least at that time, was about 29%. So it's pretty significantly different for us. We found that GCF's donors are less engaged with the foundation than donors at the average foundation. But those who have engaged with GCF are more satisfied and more likely to refer a friend. We found that GCF's caseload of donor relations staff per donor relationship was much higher than at the average foundation. And we found that 72% of GCF's donors want to be self-sufficient in their giving. Well, when we finished the donor perception report, and we'd had some preliminary conversations with Kevin by phone, we decided that the next step for us was to invite Kevin and his colleague Liz to come to Cincinnati to present the results of our donor perception report to first our governing board, and then later that same day to our staff and to a task force of donors who were invited to help us deeply analyze the DPR and to make specific prioritized recommendations to build on our strengths and to help us identify opportunities that needed improvement. The first meeting of the task force raised some important questions, which we then answered in a document that helped to frame the work of the task force. And we provided some clarification to our donor volunteers, which might be helpful to you as well, just to give a little bit of context. One of the questions that a member of the task force asked in that first meeting was, does GCF know what it wants to be, and you're asking us to help you to get there, or are you asking us to help you figure out what you should be? And so we went back to that next meeting and said, GCF knows what it wants to be, and we're asking you to help us get there. We also clarified to them, and this probably makes sense to all of you, but it didn't seem completely obvious to them, that when we talk about donor engagement, we're not describing the degree to which a donor is engaged with the community. We feel that anyone who establishes a donor-advised fund and makes grants to nonprofits in the community is sort of by definition engaged in the community. But what we were referring to was very specifically engagement with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. And that engagement is to do whatever the donor wants to do. We don't make a value judgment about what kind of engagement a donor should have with GCF. We also clarified to this group of donors that GCF has two areas of focus. First is working with donors who care about building a better community in whatever way they wish to do that. We cannot do any work in the community without first having donors who care. And second, we believe it's our job to invest resources that have been left to GCF's discretion to actively work to build a better community. And this happens obviously through the work that we do to both respond to the needs of the community as well as proactively address community issues and opportunities and apply resources towards those. That's what you all do. One task force member asked us in that first meeting, does GCF want to be more than just a tool? And the answer is yes, but only for those donors who would find that valuable. The truth is that we cannot adequately staff the demand if all of our donors wanted something from us. In the end, GCF wants and needs a mix of donors. We need those transactional donors. They help to pay the bills. But we want to be valuable to all of them. So the approach that we took to the task force's work, to back up just a little bit, in 2006, the Giving Strategies group, my colleagues and I, did an assessment of our donor-advised funds. And yeah, we do have the slide up there. I wanted to make sure. We assessed our donor-advised funds with the goal of segmenting or tiering our donors. We then used this tiering information as a part of our donor survey, so our results were made available by tier. This then became the lens for focusing the work of the task force. Each tier is very much different. So taken in the order of importance for the work of the task force, we started with Tier 2 donors. We found that they are satisfied with the relationship with GCF, but through the data, our Tier 2 donors anonymously reported, anonymously being the challenge, that they have the greatest interest in becoming more engaged with and in the foundation. So we see this as a great area of opportunity for us. We then moved to our Tier 3 donors. These are donors who are happy with self-service, and they don't want more from GCF. GCF really is just a tool to them. This self-service approach, we felt, though, could put them at risk for seeking other non-community-based donor-advised fund providers, like commercial funds. So our goal with this group was to find ways to increase their involvement with GCF, which would result in greater loyalty to GCF, or put another way, we hoped to find unobtrusive ways to add value to their relationship. And then finally, we turned to our Tier 1 donors. These are engaged, very satisfied donors, and many of them are the donors who have shared their charitable goals with GCF and have found a great deal of added value through their relationship with GCF. So we're going to keep doing what we've been doing and work to further solidify and deepen these relationships. The task force, through a series of 4 meetings, gave us terrific input and ideas, and we also convened a subgroup of them to help us to prioritize some of the ideas. So I want to tell you first 2 major themes that we heard from the task force. And I have to tell you, these are not rocket science, but they are confirmation from donors of things that we have always believed to be important, and so that was a very good thing. So the first was they recognized and said back to us the importance of building relationships, and that this work is best done one-on-one, and that the data obviously showed that we didn't have enough people to do a really good job of this. The second theme was that donors have unique needs and circumstances, and that we have to understand that, and we have to customize our approach to each individual donor. Some of the particular recommendations that the task force covered in several different areas. First were we needed to hire another person, and we've just completed that. We've hired a director of donor relations. This is his 4th week, and he's here at the conference, so we've accomplished one. Again, the relationship building and the importance of that, where we will definitely focus primarily on our Tier 1 and 2 donors to build those relationships. We got some recommendations about donor-specific communications, which on a very tactical level will result in an primarily electronic newsletter specifically for donors. We'll take some of the suggestions from the task force about how we go about providing new donor orientations, and we'll also experiment with some of their suggestions about encouraging current donors to recommend GCF to a friend. The results of the donor perception report, as I mentioned before, reflected our strong success in working with and through professional advisors. But the downside to that success, at least for us, is that sometimes the advisor plays such a strong role in getting a new fund established, really involving us very minimally, that it's difficult for us to actually begin a relationship with our new donors. So as a result of what we heard from the donor perception report, we're going to be tweaking some of our messaging to our professional advisor colleagues to take their understanding of GCF beyond sort of the ease and convenience of a donor-advised fund, which was very prominent in our word cloud. Ease and convenience, that's been our message for about 5 years, and that's what we heard. But we're going to work to go beyond that with our with our professional advisors, and we're also going to enlist their help in setting up the expectation that part of the process of creating a new fund is, in fact, a welcome meeting for a new donor. Overall, the experience that we had with our task force was very positive for both the participants and for the staff. We felt that even if no actionable suggestions had resulted from the work of the task force, it still would have been worthwhile, simply because of the level of engagement with GCF achieved by this group of donors, pretty much all of whom had never been engaged with us before. That was just a terrific outcome. And we heard good suggestions and had great conversation to boot. We did a follow-up survey of the task force, and a comment from that survey said that the task force project was handled in a very professional manner. The materials were helpful, and I felt the group was serious and thoughtful in the discussions we had. And another said, I liked the overall process and GCF's commitment to making the engagement a positive experience and quality process. Okay, now can you change that? In our final meeting with our task force, we reminded them of this graphic that they had seen in an earlier meeting. What this shows is our newish logo with possible stages of involvement superimposed on it. Anyone who encounters GCF can be anywhere along this path, and one person may encounter GCF in different ways and be at different points along the path and for different types of interactions with the foundation. We meet people where they are, and through our interaction, they move along the path as they learn more about the foundation. At the final meeting of the task force, we asked them, now that you've been through this process with us, how do you feel? Where were you, and where are you now? One task force member commented, I'm now at I do, and beyond, at I am. But I'm also still at I don't know with respect to some aspects of GCF. He now realizes that there are things he wants to know more about. Another member of the task force said, I started at I don't know, and have moved to I know, and I want to know more.
Thank you, Amy. I think we'll hold questions for Amy and our other panelists until we hear the stories from Napa Valley and the Communities Foundation of Texas as well. So Terence, you want to take it away?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about three things. First, why did we do this? Secondly, what did we learn? And thirdly, what did we do with what we learned? Given a very limited staffing structure, we're a young, scrappy, adolescent community foundation in a rural county, 20 million in assets, but we are a fairly active grant maker. We probably distribute between, geez, that's on now. Feedback of a different sort, I suppose. $2.5 to $3 million a year in both donor advised fund and discretionary grants. So, why did we do the DPR? We were really eager to get feedback. We'd never really done any kind of comprehensive survey of our donor base, and we were about 3 years into a fairly radical and different way of working with our fund holders. Whereby we ask all of our donor-advised fund holders who have an expendable fund at the foundation to contribute 5% of their initial contribution and 5% of their fund balance each year to a suite of different discretionary field of interest funds where the foundation's board has discretion. And the idea is that we live in a place that is beautiful, but faces significant challenges around immigration, around social equity, around water, around pressure on agricultural lands from development, about the way in which land use and transportation and climate change are related. It's sort of our point of view that the future of California is being written in the hinterlands in places like Fresno and Shasta and Mendocino. And the punchline is there's not a nickel of organized philanthropic capital outside of the major metros. I mean, there is a nickel, but in San Francisco, that number per foundation grants per capita per year is $800. Napa County's $55 or $60. Yolo County's maybe $2. So the idea is that we ask our fund holders to do more because we have to, because we want to be involved in social change, not just fund administration. So we were really eager to know how do they feel about this, because we're sort of pretty grabby, right? And we wanted to get some feedback. So that was the predominant thing. Secondly, we didn't have to pay for it, which was just beautiful. So our dear friends at the James Irvine Foundation, some of us, and I see some of my colleagues here, have been part of a 6-year, $12 million initiative where they're trying to lift a group of rural California community foundations sort of into their adulthood with general support and TA, and this was a piece of it. So, a very attractive price point. And lastly, when you work at a community foundation, you live in this world where you don't often get real, honest, constructive feedback from anybody. So from your grantee partners, it's like love and sunshine all the time, 24/7. And you wind up hearing from the donors who like to talk to you. And so there's this broad spectrum of donor engagement, as we all know. And I spend most of my time with the people who really value what we do. And I don't talk much because they don't return my phone calls, frankly. So it's like, let's hear from everybody and really understand where we are. So what did we learn on the pro side? I would say that there was some fabulous validating, affirming, uplifting stuff around do we understand our donors' interests and wishes and objectives? Do they think that we deeply understand, the nonprofit sector in Napa County? Do they think we're a leader? Do they think that we are delivering impact? And so all that stuff was just beautiful. And sort of, on at least in our initial cohort, on sort of many of the measures of satisfaction and impact perceived by donors, we were, if not the top-ranked community foundation, always above the median, and that was great to hear. And on the con side, what we heard is you're slow. With respect to the transaction, the cycle time of how long does it take to get a grant out of this place? There's only 5.5 full-time equivalents. Investment performance and transparency of investment results was another issue, and golly, it would be nice if you had online account access. There were sort of three big things in terms of where we needed improvement. So what do we do with the report? For us, when this thing landed, it was like I imagine life in an Inuit fishing village where the whale has come in. It's like, oh my God, there's so much here. Where do we begin? What are we going to do with this thing? It's like we could eat for years based on just what we learned. Truly, it was an illuminating, fabulous moment, and we have we're still working on this thing. So we printed 60 copies at full color. And mailed it to every single one of our donor-advised fund holders. Our scope was just donor-advised fund holders. I called every single one of those people and invited them to have a conversation about, this is what you all said in the aggregate. What do you think? because life is like the 80-20 rule, you know, I wound up having a cup of coffee with maybe 13 or 14 of those people. Not all of them were, some of them were fresh faces, but most of them were the people we sort of knew already. We took action on the two things that seemed to be most nettlesome to people, so we were frankly in the process already of switching to a new investment advisor, but we were able to say, hey, you know, you speak, we listen, we've changed investment advisory platforms. The timing was very serendipitous that way. And we, you know, so, and now we publish every year a report on our investment performance against benchmarks, which, you know, is sort of buried someplace, but we make some noise and we say this is, you know, our commitment to stewardship and being transparent. The other thing is that we have taken some steps, given our limitations as a small foundation who doesn't yet have online account access, to sort of say, okay, let's send an email notification when someone sends in a grant recommendation form, because otherwise the old experience was, I'm a donor advisor, I send you my grant recommendation form, and then it's radio silence for 2 weeks until such time as I get the mail in an A10 envelope that says, you know, here's a blind carbon copy of the grant distribution that went to the Boys and Girls Club. Not so satisfying, sort of in terms of real time. So we've done some things about email notification to people, and are moving in the direction of having online accounts. And then we also, one of our sort of core values is transparency and accountability. So we did publish the whole darn thing on our website. I did a series of different email communications to professional advisors to say, hey, you know, we are about accountability, about being responsible stewards of your clients' contributed assets, as well as asking our nonprofit partners to be accountable. And so, as testament to this, you know, if you want to see what people think is wrong with us, go to page 43. If you want to see what people are praising about us, go to page 45. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. So we published the whole DPR, and we did some additional outreach with regard to professional advisors, and that's where I think I'll stop.
Great. Thanks, Terence. And I think one of the things you'll see is that certainly very different community foundations up on the panel today. Sarah from the Communities Foundation of Texas is the most recent of the three of these folks to have received the report. So Terence had his a little bit earlier. Amy's was the beginning of this year, and Sarah's was mid-year this year. So the most recent experience with donor feedback.
I'm going to start by setting a little bit of a frame for my comments today. So I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer for the Communities Foundation of Texas. And the one thing that I would hope that you would take away from today is encouragement, as has been made many times over in many of the sessions throughout this conference, which is there's terrific value in listening to your donors, whether that be the ways we were encouraged in the right brain, left brain session about listening at an individual level, or about donor surveys, which is really at the macro level. And I think there are very few of you out there who wouldn't agree that we all could benefit by learning more about our donors, again, whether it's at the micro or at the macro level. And I would say, too, that even though all of us are users of this particular tool, this Center for Effective Philanthropy donor survey, and I would then say that it's a little like the Men's Hair Club. You know, I'm a spokesperson, but also a client, and do want to acknowledge that. The other thing that I would say is that if you have tuned out at all because you think, oh gosh, this is just a commercial for CEP, I would rather you step back and say, no, this is a way to listen to donors, and there are many different ways you can do it. And in fact, we at the Communities Foundation of Texas, we did a survey of our donors in 2008, which was before CEP had this tool, and at the time I actually wouldn't have had the budget for it. because this tool is a little more expensive, although there are some terrific opportunities out there, like the Irvine Foundation in California that was a sponsor. The Gates Foundation is actually making it easier for organizations of many sizes to use this particular tool. But you can do surveys in many different ways. And in 2008, we did a survey that we created ourselves, but with help, and there are other foundations out there that did it. And the more that we can call upon each other, the better. This helps because it's a terrific tool out there now that has benchmarking data where you can see where you stack up against other foundations, other community foundations, number one. But then as foundations are added to the participant list, we eventually will be able to see how do I look compared to those of similar size or similar region or that sort of thing. But I'd give a shout out just to the Dallas Foundation, who is really our co-opetition in Dallas. We're a very unusual situation where there are two community foundations in Dallas, but really it's a gentle rivalry and we love each other. But they had done a donor survey before we did, and I called them up and said, would you mind letting us see your survey instrument, not the results? Of course, we don't want each other to know exactly what each of the donors said about each other. But they shared their survey with me, and I used some of the identical questions, and there were some of our results in that year that we did compare with one another. And that was exciting. So there are other ways to do it, and that was one that even though we created the survey instrument, we hired someone, another third party, to do it for us, because one of the things that you will hear, you can ask donors directly what they think, and you will get some light shed, and that is one way to do it, and that is the cheapest way to do it. But you also can go to a third party, whether it's CEP or someone else, and you will get a little bit better information because there's a buffer between, and the donors feel more protected. So, again, I encourage you, whichever way you do it, whether you use CEP or you go a different route, to think about how you can get better perspective on your donors. And the thing about surveys that you don't get at the individual level, I mean, you can ask your donors for feedback all the time and you will get one picture, but often you will miss trends that really can inform strategic choices that you make in your foundation moving forward. And certainly, we just did a strategic plan in the past couple of years, and it was really interesting to get this information back, particularly because we had some of the same questions that we asked when we did our survey before we finished our strategic plan in 2008, and then to be able to compare even just to ourselves with what came out of that this year in 2011. So we are fairly large. We have over 900 funds, over 540 of which are donor-advised funds. And really, when it comes to the feedback, that, as it turns out, is what we care the most about, because it affects most of some of the choices we're going to make. But you can see on this slide up there that those funds, those donor-advised funds, represent over half of our total funds. But we included, you can choose, what kind of funds you include. We included most everything, and we had a pretty decent response rate, which was 39%. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about us, just as a way to give an example of how you can use survey data to inform choices within your foundation. Again, not that you care so much about what we're doing in Dallas, other than the Dallas Foundation, who may be taking copious notes, but we freely would share any of this with anyone, including the Dallas Foundation, who we dearly love. Truly, we all love each other, and we're so happy actually to work in the same city together. We have tremendous colleagues in that way. But so one of the things that we ask CEP, when we had the advantage of asking CEP when we did it with them this year, was for at least the handful that you've done, what has successful survey follow-up looked like? Because that's a really important key. What are you going to do with the information, and how you do it? How does that earn you more bang for the buck eventually? And these were some things that they told us that we have found to be true. So having strong board leadership and executive staff support of the survey, so whether good news or bad news comes back, and you'll get some of both, that you're willing to have the light shine on it and be willing to share it at a minimum internally, and some people aren't, and so you have to be prepared. Don't do this unless you are willing to hear the bad news, because that is where the richness is in what you can change. Cultivation of an open and transparent response to comments, which sometimes can be hard depending on what you're hearing. Involvement of donors and staff in developing solutions, which we are not yet to that point with donors, but that was one of the things that Terence was talking about, and I fully support. CEP came back and said, select a manageable number of areas from the survey to focus on moving the needle on, and that may seem pretty simplistic, but actually is golden advice, because you can only do so many things, and so pick a few to work on and really then move the needle. And then continue to monitor your progress with regular survey follow-up. And it's even better if you can say to the donor, we're going to do this every X number of years. We're not quite sure yet, because we have to kind of get a feel for what feels right. We suspect it's going to be around 3 years. It was 4 years. No, it was 3 years. That's right. It was 3 years since we did the last one, which was, again, not the CEP survey. So, and the things that for us came out of it, we found some very interesting things. And again, one of the fascinating things about getting feedback from a survey is that particularly if you have your own, the more information you have on your funds and on the characteristics of the fund holders, the more interesting slicing and dicing you can do when you get the information back. So, one of the things that we found out was that our longest term donors or fund holders, the ones that had been with us the longest, so you would figure they would, if they've stuck it out, they would really, be loyal to us. They were kind of the least satisfied. They felt kind of neglected. And what richness to know that before they leave, right? I mean, that was terrific to know. And in some ways, it made a lot of sense once we saw it. But those were also the donors that weren't really speaking up. They were fine. They're more transactional. We're doing the business. But they had seen some of the shifts that we had made in the past few years regarding strategy. And I think they felt kind of left behind. And we'd changed some things, and we changed some things that it turns out they really liked, that we could easily bring back. And so there was a real richness to that. I'm trying to think of a few other examples, but that's sort of the idea that there are things that are hidden that when you get it back at the macro level, you can do something about, and often it's super low-hanging fruit. And in terms of, I know that Amy was talking about resource allocation, that you can make choices about how to assign staff based on what you hear. So our list of our manageable number of areas were 4. The first was to strengthen professional advisor relationships. We could see that was really important when they were asked, how did you come to us? It was very clear that the number of people coming to us, particularly that we perhaps valued the most, not that we ever want to say that, right? We value all our donors, but there were those ones you value more. They were coming from professional advisors, and we wanted to be sure to really focus on strengthening those relationships. The second was that we had it was obvious at the macro level that we had not done a terrific job at increasing wallet share, that there was willingness on the part of donors to engage more with us or put more money with us, and in fact, they had a number of vehicles by which they were conducting philanthropic giving, and that there was an opportunity there that we were missing because we were allocating more resources to going out and getting new donors than we were to continued cultivation of the ones we had, which is sort of 101, but again, sometimes these things have to reach up and knock you in the noggin before you really do something about it. The third was that we needed, which is related to this, we needed to focus more on stewardship. And so that example I gave you about our longest term donors, there were a couple easy things we could do that some people had not heard from us for a long time. I mean, they were getting a lot of mailings, but apparently we used to have, and this is even before my time, and I've been there for 3.5 years, we used to have a meeting every year, of sort of an annual membership meeting. But at some point, there was the perception that there wasn't a lot of value out of that, and it seemed kind of, cursory, and so we stopped doing it. Well, apparently, some of those donors that are really important to us loved it. They loved coming. And so, well, it's relatively easy to do. And so we're bringing back something that we're now calling Annual Report Live. So we're bringing our annual report to life in our building in one night. We're going to bring agencies in for them to hear from. We're going to talk about some of our new initiatives, bringing donors closer to the activity of the foundation. And we're really excited about that. We think that that is, again, a fairly easy thing for us to do, to win back a little bit of the contact and that feel of relationship with some of our donors. Have more issue-focused events, try piloting some personalized site visits based on some of the comments. And then sort of an easy thing to do that we just, again, basically had overlooked in all of the other activities that we'd been involved in, was we now made a commitment that in the next 12 months, we will be in touch with every donor and fund advisor, which is, at this point, 900 some odd, to better understand their needs, their wants, et cetera, on an individual level. So to take that macro and understand the micro. And then finally, for us, moving toward implementing a comprehensive communications plan, which again, it was kind of something we had on the table, but is easy to say, oh, look, you said you wanted more communication, and now we're doing it. But it clarified where we needed to focus first. We needed to focus on identity. We needed to focus on a clarity of message, and again, on website functionality and performance. And that was another issue for us. That was about being smart about allocation of resources, because we had such a high percentage of people who were using our website, wanted to use our website more, which of course from a resource efficiency perspective is terrific, except that they had tons of complaints about our website and about its functionality. And even though we knew, I think we kind of made up excuses. Well, we're a community foundation, and we're not Vanguard, and we can't afford it. And then we really looked at the data and we thought, how can we not afford it? How can we not afford to invest in the number one thing that people want to use, and which today is important to everyone across the board? And people are used to much more real time in their banking and everything, and so we need to be moving forward with that. So those were just some of our learnings, and those are the type of things that I would say that you too can learn from doing a survey of your donors or listening tours of your donors. There are a lot of ways to do it. And whether it's CEP or something else, again, I am a client, and I likely will do this again with CEP in 3 years, because I think it's been really fabulous to be able to benchmark ourselves against others and get a better sense of where we stand across the board. But I would not let that stand in your way, because sometimes it can be expensive. I would go out and try to figure out the best way to do it for you.
Thank you, and thanks to each of our panelists. A couple words, and then what I want to turn to are questions for our panelists from all of you. And I appreciate Sarah's point that getting feedback from donors can be helpful regardless of whether you work with CEP or not. Obviously, I have a perspective that the more folks who participate in this particular survey, the deeper research that we can do on the field as a whole, and that's all free, available research that we just make available to anybody in the field. So that's sort of the incentive for us to increase the size of the data set, as well as increasing its utility for individuals. And Sarah mentioned one particular thing that I want to point out, and you all saw on your tables, I think, some background information from about this process. We encourage you to think about how you want to get feedback from your donors, regardless of whether it's with us or not. On the tables are copies of our donor survey, the standard questions that we ask. They're proprietary, but at the same time, we think they will hopefully help stimulate for you, not only in a survey, but in the other ways that you work with donors, the kinds of questions that you might be, that might be really important to ask of your donors. These questions were developed with a task force of 12.5 community foundations as they thought about what the most important issues were to hear about from their donors. So take those and think about them. The other thing I would point out, and Sarah mentioned this, is that it's true that the Gates Foundation, in order to stimulate research on this topic of community foundation donor engagement and motivation, has for this year and will again for next year subsidize half the cost of participating in this donor survey until
Act now, 50% off.
until the scholarship money runs out. Thanks, Sarah. So that's what Sarah was mentioning when she said her survey was subsidized by the Gates Foundation. So with those kinds of little pieces of background, questions from you all for Amy and Terence and Sarah. Jackie first, and then we'll go here.
Really good eyes. I'm impressed. I don't know how long it's been for all of you. You said that. I'm sorry, I missed it. But have you been able to track any financial returns that you could correlate to changes you made as a result of the survey, like increased giving to donor advised funds or specifically members of the cohort? Or
So, yep. So.
I don't mean to be crass, but that'll be the kind of bottom line that for an expenditure like this might work with that.
Let me just repeat the question for those in the back of the room who might not have been able to hear it as well. The question was, for the panelists, has anybody had the opportunity or seen a correlation between changes in giving or increased giving based on the changes that they made in response to the donor survey?
I'm just saying I'm going to take myself out of this because we just got our data back, so it's way too early for me.
And I think that for us, it's also pretty recent because we got our data in the beginning of this year. But there is, I think, one very real outcome that will have a financial payoff in a longer period, and that is the hiring of a director of donor relations. And when we took that request to the Finance Committee, because it wasn't budgeted for this year, to get their approval to add that to our budget, that was one of the questions they asked. They said, well, clearly this is a position that has a payoff. How are you going to measure that? So we will be measuring that, but we also know that building relationships takes time, and so a financial return on that investment will take some time before it's going to be obvious to see. But yeah, I think it'll be a little longer before we see that.
We got our results in 2010 in the spring. Our revenues in 2011 were 100% higher than 2010, but I wouldn't tell you that those things are correlated. I mean, I think under the category of affirming the decision of donors who really believe in us to continue, it did something for us. But and most of the revenue in 11 was from the close-in batch of donors that we all work so hard to keep engaged with the foundation. But it's not. I don't think it's correlation. I think it's a happy coincidence.
I think Kate's next. Kate, can I ask you to use the microphone so that I don't have to repeat the question? Thank you.
I wanted to get some more information about your task force, Amy. How many donors were surveyed, and how big was your task force to represent your donor pool?
All right, we surveyed, I believe it was 755 donors. And we invited, we probably invited about 24 people to participate in the task force. I think we had about 12 to 15 who did participate. And as I said, these were people who had not been engaged with us in any significant way, and it was really very valuable. We've actually done that in a couple of other areas too.
That's a cool idea. Terry?
Related to the same question, but a different way. Do you have a standing donor services committee or some such appellation, such committee? And secondly, if so, or marketing committee, and if so, did you utilize them beforehand to help guide the survey process? And if you had to do it over again, would you have used them initially?
All right. We have a Giving Strategies Committee. It has not been the most productive of volunteer groups for us. And about a year ago, we talked to a couple of other community foundations, including Columbus, about how you work with volunteer groups and committees for your development function. And we made a recommendation at that time to sort of restructure their work and to work through task forces. So this was actually the first task force, and we've done a couple of others this year. The committee still exists, but they have not met since last year. They're going to meet probably in October or November. We did not engage them to a great degree in the sort of pre-survey discussion. They saw the survey as a draft. They said it's too long, and that was about it. And then we went ahead and we did the survey. So that's kind of how we used that group.
The back, and then we'll move up to right next to the microphone. So it's freezing in here. Walk forward. Get the blood flowing.
Sarah, this question is for you. You mentioned that your donors had specific requests regarding your website. Can you share some of those?
Yeah, specific requests, but low-hanging fruit. So the list is long, and some of it came out in some of the open-ended responses. But for us, and some of you may struggle with this, and you were saying you weren't even online at the time, but we are online. You can make requests online, but we have had some of the same problems in terms of grant processing, that even though technically you could make the request online, then it was like all radio silence for 2 weeks or more sometimes till you got confirmation. And then suddenly we had this change where we're trying to be more tree friendly, and we canceled sending people their follow-up, and yet there was no confirmation at all. People didn't like that. Yeah, I mean, I have a donor advised fund just so I can play with it to make sure, you know, what works and what doesn't. I found that to be incredibly irritating because you just never knew. Did that go through? You know, did it not? We also have the ability to go on and look at your fund statement online, but some of the functionality is just, you know, confusing. Our website isn't configured. You know, we haven't had a usability test. You know, we threw it up there and haven't changed it for years. And, you know, we got a new mission statement a year ago. It's nowhere on our website. I mean, stuff like that. So it's not like the donors are saying, hey, could you put your new mission statement up? I was really wanting that. But just, we were kind of behind the times, and we'd neglected to invest properly, I think, in upgrading things that needed to be upgraded, that we should be comparing, you know, we should be going out and looking at Vanguard's website. We should go out and look at sort of the National Donor Advised Fund competition and see what are they doing and how fast is it. And, you know, actually it sounds like they'd be willing to talk to us about it, since we're not competition, we're, what is it called, compliments, because that's what we are competing with. And it's not just competing with specific competition, it's competing with the concept that we now have about how we live as a society, about you're competing with the concept of going online to your bank and seeing everything in real time. I mean, that was another thing. People would say, well, you know, your stuff updates every 24 hours, but that's not fast enough. I want to know in real time. Or the grant request doesn't update until it goes out the door, but I want to see that at least it's pending, so at least I know that you all are taking action. Otherwise, you know, I don't know if I should be calling you, or so things like that. I mean, I just think that it was kind of a wake-up call to us that, yeah, we all knew the website was, kind of crummy, but what, you know, there are a million things to do, and none of us were thinking about the website. We were all thinking about our cool programs, and we're thinking about, you know, neat events and luncheons, and, you know, how are we going to use our discretionary money, and how are we going to engage, you know, but we weren't really, no one was really thinking about the website. And that, again, is some of the great value, is that we completely reprioritized that, given the feedback, because it was suddenly crystal clear to us that we couldn't afford not to. And not only would we allocate resources, but we would significantly move it up on the timing list. Although we just got this information back. You can go to my website right now. It's still as crummy as it ever was. We haven't fixed it yet. So, but by the end of the year, we hope it'll be better.
Thanks.
And I can't resist commenting. I will look forward at a future conference to hear a little bit more about whether donors' expressed desire for that kind of immediacy really gets exercised, because I've talked to a couple of colleagues who are further ahead on that sort of donor express kind of thing, and because it was another password, and the foundation did it, but nobody's using it. And I also get worried that because there's no way we could do daily updates, that we're going to put ourselves in a side-by-side comparison situation that's just going to call further attention to the fact that we're not But anyway, that's something else. What I wanted to ask about, because I just finished developing my own board self-evaluation survey for a variety of reasons. But I wanted to ask, let's just say we're about $150 million. We probably have 80 or 100 donor advisors, maybe up to 300 people that we'd actually survey in this. Can you give us a hint about what kind of money you're talking about, and then help me understand in this survey gizmo world? I mean, really the decision we all end up making is, what's the cost of what you're proposing versus the time and energy it would take to us to develop a survey gizmo? Can you?
Sure. That's a tough question because it varies on the price or the cost of this tool varies depending on the kinds of customization you want, the amount of engagement you want from CEP. And actually one of the biggest drivers of cost is whether you can reach your donors electronically. What we try to do, obviously, is create a really nice looking survey. It's a communications vehicle for all of you. We want it to make sure that it's appropriate to the way that you want yourself presented to your donors. So the price varies pretty dramatically, but the low end of the costs are in around the sort of $6,000 range, half off, for Gates in 2012, up to
$6,000 before the 50% off, right?
It's great. Yeah. And then it rises all the way up to the $15,000 or $18,000 for much larger donor surveys. I think, given the characteristics you pointed out, we would be sort of towards certainly in the lower half of that range.
And I'm sorry now because I confused myself. Is 6,000? Is that 3,000 during 2011?
And 2012.
And 2012. Please.
Amy, you had talked a little bit about adding value to those self-sufficient donors who obviously are a huge hunk of what we all do. I was wondering how you do that, and I mean for all of our panelists how you do that, but you had mentioned it, so thanks.
That's a great question, and that one's probably going to take us a little longer to actually implement. But what much of the many of the suggestions that came from the task force had to do with technology tools. So we have Advisor Express, Donor Central, and a number of the suggestions that they gave had to do with enhancements to that donor portal. It will probably be 12 to 18 months before we're actually able to do that, but we know that those tier 3 donors don't want more from us, so they don't want us calling them and saying, hey, can we have lunch? They're not even going to return our calls, as Terence said. So the idea was, how can we unobtrusively add value to the experience that they have? Virtually every suggestion in that group was really something related to technology, and that's a challenge for all of us. But we're gonna try to work on that. We actually just instituted a technology committee or task force or something over the summer, and so they will be enlisted along the way to help us to think about how can we make some of these changes. But it will take us a little bit longer to get there.
I can't resist the temptation to comment on the things that people have just said about technology and about the, to me, shocking stack of people who don't want what we do, who don't value what we know about our communities, who aren't interested in social change or leverage. Why don't we let them all go? Let them go. Let Vanguard have them. I mean, it's the end of the day, so the hyperbole meter just went up just a notch. But truly, like, I don't want to invest more in Donor Central to sort of play and pretend. It won't be long before people are going on site visits and trying to use their iPhones to it's like, I can't do that. I probably couldn't do it with $100 million. Let them go. Let somebody else take care of those people, and then charge the people who love you more money. And that's how we float the financial vote. Just a point of discussion.
A debate for the future. And before we get to this question, I'll add one more thing on technology. One of the questions we've asked in the survey for a lot of foundations, this is a customized question many have asked, is questions about social media. How do donors want to be interacting with the foundation through social media? The overwhelming response, and I kid you not, the proportion is exceedingly close to 0% of donors who say they want anything to do with the foundation via Facebook, Twitter, or any other sort of social media. So before you let that wave carry you forward, don't waste your effort there. Question?
Good to know. I kind of have two questions, and I guess one is, do you have plans to match the results from all these surveys to best practices that worked to impact the organizations from those results? So, you know, what did these three and all the others go out and do in common based on what they learned, and match that so that you can kick back, you know, like when you buy a book on Amazon, others who had this problem also tried this, and it worked. Is that in the game plan in the future? I know you need to have data to do that, but if you're not collecting that data now, please do.
Absolutely, that's part of the sort of broader research plan that, again, we want to make available not just to the folks who are using this tool, but for others who might face common challenges or have common challenges raised to them wherever they got that challenge raised for them. So yes, that's in the future planning.
Cool. And then do you have a platform like this for measuring nonprofits in communities? One of my interests is in the economic development world. There are tools that are used nationally across all different cities where CEOs are interviewed, and that information is used to measure the strength and weakness and opportunities in the business community. And I think that'd be a great tool for community foundations in particular to understand the strengths and opportunities for nonprofits, and then use that information to inform donors and grant making, et cetera. Do you have a platform like that?
We don't, in part because we think that there are some other efforts underway in the sector that will help provide some of that. A very basic version of it is the independent sector and BBBY's Giving Alliance and GuideStar's collaboration on an effort called the Impact Framework that seeks to have nonprofits submit a standard set of information about their goals, their strategy, the outcomes they're looking for, and the outcomes that they're getting that could be accessed through GuideStar, and then that's piped in through Donor Central and some other kinds of technology tools. So we think that those efforts are underway. They're clearly valuable both to donors and to individual foundations. It's just not where the Center for Effective Philanthropy thinks our resources are best oriented right now. I think we might have time for one more question, if there is one more question.
Kevin, would you allow me to make a comment?
Oh, sure.
It's just been percolating as everything we've been talking about. You know, one of the things that I think you can use survey data in a lot of different ways, but the most interesting thing to do with survey data is to allow it to be a little provocative, and to allow it to bother you a little bit, and to allow it to allow yourself not to answer some of the questions that it poses right away. So one of the things that Amy said that was really interesting is when the donors it was the task force, right, that asked, do you know what you want to be and you're asking us what we think about it, or do you want to know what we want you to be? You know, we didn't ask, we just went ahead and did the survey. But there's a way in which that question came back at us through the survey. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, we redid our strategic plan a couple of years ago, and, you know, what you helped build, you own, and I was a part of doing this new strategic plan, and I have my fingerprints all over it, and I love it. I think it's great, and I'm so excited where we're going with it, and I'm thrilled to pieces about it. And yet, when we got the survey data back, it didn't look like that was exactly what donors wanted. And then we've had to ask ourselves the question, to which right now there is no answer. Is that because it's like Facebook or like Twitter, that really they don't want it and they're never going to want it, and so you shouldn't bother? Or is it like the quote that someone put up, you know, that Henry Ford said, is something along the lines of, well, if you'd ask America what they wanted in better transportation, they would have said a faster horse. Or someone said, and then he would have never built the car, which of course we, you know, swear by now. Or someone told me the story about pay at the pump, where they did a lot of focus groups about gasoline and pay at the pump. And when everyone was asked about pay at the pump in a focus group, everyone said, oh no, I wouldn't want to do that. No, I want the interaction. I want the personal interaction with the gas attendant. I'd really hate to lose that. How many of you feel that way today? You know, drive by and you're like, oh, no, pay the pump, forget it. I'm going someplace else. Because we couldn't conceive of the shift. And so we still struggle with this question. You know, in fact, Dallas, when we compare ourselves, the Communities Foundation, and I'm sure that the Dallas Foundation would see the same thing, because I think it's about our city and part of the mindset of our city, which differs from Silicon Valley and differs from the Seattle Foundation in terms of characteristics of the population. But when you ask them about, you know, what percentage want to be self-sufficient versus want advice versus really want a partner in you, we have an even higher percentage than the rest of the group that's done it. They really want to be self-sufficient, and actually they really kind of want you to leave them alone. But we're gambling. You know, we're gambling that there are a percentage, and like Amy said, it would be we would bury ourselves if we converted everyone. We can't afford to convert everyone. But we're gambling that you don't even know what the possibilities are, and once you do, you will be so thrilled you can't imagine you ever did it another way. And yet even today, listening today and in other sessions, I've continued to wrestle with this. I don't know the answer, and I wonder to the extent that we're trying to push something, at least us, are trying to push something on our donors that maybe they really don't want. And I don't know the answer, and so I'm allowing that to bother me.
One last quick question, and then I think we'll thank our panelists. I hope it's a quick question.
Try to be quick. So I had two parts. One was about response rate, and maybe it's for you, Kevin, or the panelists. Were you satisfied with the response rate that you got? I don't remember what the first one was, Cincinnati, but I saw 39, 40 something, whatever. And the second question I had is in selecting your donors, did you have a particular method or strategy for who you surveyed? Was it length of time with you, amount of money they give, or was it really random? So those were my two questions.
Let me take a first crack at that because we have some advice, guidance for folks. First on the response rate, the typical response rates tend to be in the 30% range. And because we know who donors are, it's a confidential but not an anonymous survey, we can do some non-responder bias analysis. So is it the older funds or the smaller funds or the older people who are not responding to the survey? And that can help us understand what bias might be in these responses.
Or to define that, you know, not just bias, but what may be missing, you know,
right.
what you might not know based on your data.
Exactly. And in terms of who should be surveyed, we tend to suggest that it is the entire population of donors that surveyed, because that gives you the most power to cut the data in the end, based on the kinds of characteristics that you have in the foundation. We require everybody to survey their donor-advised funds, and then many foundations add other types of donors in addition to that. But we suggest to go as comprehensive as possible, and then we can help you work through the ways that that data might be of value.
We had a 34% response rate. We surveyed, it was 755 donor advisors. It was substantially all of our donor-advised funds. Today we have 850. Donor advised fund. We took out a couple, I think, because they were weird and probably would give a response that would have skewed things. So, not necessarily in a bad way. They just weren't representative.
All right. Let me please join me in thanking our excellent panelists. And then, as you're walking out, if anybody wants the last data point that I was going to talk about, we asked donors how important different factors are in their decisions to give and continue to give to a community foundation versus other charitable options they have. And this is on a 1 to 7 scale, the importance to them of these different characteristics that are exemplified by some community foundations. So just food for thought as you're leaving. Thank you all for joining today.